let's say we're trying to understand the truth, right? That's our goal here. We want to understand the truth of a particular moment in history. So I'm going to suggest we apply these ideas to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. It's on my mind because we just passed the anniversary of it this past weekend. Okay? March 2003, the United States launched an invasion of Iraq. I don't think that that's, a question. We all probably remember that, even if we were younger, as you were. Okay? Now we want to ask a question. The question is, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? Was it legal? Did it conform to international and domestic law? It's an important question. When any nation state goes to war, it's important to ask a question: does the act of war conform with both international and domestic law? So we want to ask a question. Was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? We want to know the truth of that, correct? You want to know the truth? Does that seem like a question about which the truth is important? You can nod, yeah. I mean, again, lots of different opinions in the room about the nature of U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, that particular military engagement. But it seems that the question is relevant, and wanting to know the truth about that question is important. So what is the truth? We have a question on the table. Was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? Did it conform with both international and domestic law? That's a question that is not, academic, not abstract. It's very real and relevant, and we want to know the truth of it. Okay? So how do we determine the truth of that? Well, first of all, we need to know something about the facts, yes? We have to engage in some sort of empirical inquiry. Now, the fact that the United States launched that invasion in 2003 really is not controversial. Right? U.S. troops were deployed, U.S. air power was used. Right? If you're old enough to remember it, it's quite a momentous day. Let's shift not from the facts of the actual invasion, which are fairly well established, to facts about the law. What does the law say? If you're going to ask and answer the question, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq lawful, you have to know something about what the law is that is relevant. And the relevant international law, in fact, we can examine. It comes from the UN Charter. Excuse me. Let me go to that. The United Nations Charter. The UN Charter is the document that structures international law today. It was 1945, the post-World War II era, the attempt to create a new approach to international law. Okay. The UN Charter, which the U.S. is not only a signatory to, but the U.S. essentially drafted. Right. The UN Charter looks the way it does for the most part because of folks in the United States who were central in the drafting of it. All right. So the UN Charter is the controlling document in international law that sets the conditions under which one nation state can engage in military action against another lawfully. Right. The UN Charter is the foundational document. So if we're going to ask, is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful, we have to go to the foundational document that sets this out. Now, this is long and complex. You have to take my word for it. You can investigate more on your own later. But the UN Charter does set this framework, and it makes it very clear. There are two conditions under which one nation state can engage in military action against another. There are two and only two conditions. The first is when the UN Security Council votes to authorize the use of military force. The UN Security Council, a group of 15 nations, 5 permanent members. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are, anybody want to guess? I'll give you a hint. One of them is United States, Russia, previously the Soviet Union, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia, China? France? And Great Britain. Okay, 5 permanent members. There are 10 other members that are elected in rotation. 5 permanent members, 10 members. The 5 permanent members are important because they have a veto. Any one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council can veto a resolution. Right. This has been in the news lately because there was recently a UN Security Council resolution to authorize the use of force against which country? Libya. Right. All right. So there are 2 conditions under which a nation state can engage in military action against another. One is when there is a resolution of the UN Security Council authorizing that military action. Right. The question then would be asked, was there such a resolution in place when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003? Does anybody know the answer to that? Was there a resolution? No, there was no resolution. The U.S. requested a resolution. The UN Security Council declined to pass such a resolution. So there was no UN Security Council resolution in place when the United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003. The other condition under which a nation state can engage in military action against another state is handled in Article 51 of Chapter 7. If you go down, you can see it. I'll send you this link too. What Article 51 says, listen, you only go to war when there's a UN Security Council resolution that authorizes it, but that doesn't mean you can't act in self-defense. So if the Canadians were about to pour over the border and invade the United States, there was an imminent threat from Canada, right? The United States would not have to wait for a UN Security Council resolution to defend itself. So the exception to the rule that military action must require a UN Security Council resolution, the exception is the right to self-defense. And there's nothing in the UN Charter which undermines the right to self-defense. But those are the 2 and only 2 conditions under which one nation state can commence military action against another. Okay? We've established that there was no UN Security Council resolution. The question then would be, was Iraq about to threaten the U.S. militarily? Was there an imminent threat that gave the U.S. the right to respond in self-defense? That would be the question. And I think the answer to that one, from my point of view, is fairly clear. The answer is no. There were a lot of discussions about weapons that Iraq may or may not have. There were lots of discussions about connections to other groups that might want to attack the U.S. that Iraq may or may not have. Now, it turned out that Iraq didn't have those weapons. It turned out that Iraq didn't have those connections to other groups. But even with those assertions that there might be such things, it doesn't appear that any of that rose to the level of an imminent threat covered in Article 51. So, for the sake of argument, you may not agree with this, but stay with me. The 2 conditions required for a state to go to war with another state, either a UN Security Council resolution or an imminent threat that could engage the right to self-defense, neither one was present. The United States invaded Iraq without a Security Council resolution and without a credible claim to be defending itself in the context of Article 51. So if there are 2 conditions under which the U.S. could go to war lawfully, and neither of those conditions was met, what would one conclude? That the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful. Now, that's the international law. The domestic law that might be relevant comes from Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which makes it clear that treaties signed by the U.S. acquire the status of what the Constitution calls the supreme law of the land. That when the United States signs a treaty, it is bound to that treaty through its own constitutional provision. So what the U.S. Constitution says is once we sign a treaty as a nation, that treaty becomes law. It has the same force of law as domestic law and the Constitution itself. So the United States is a signatory to the UN Charter. It is therefore by constitutional principle bound to the conditions of that charter. In a sense, you could say that the UN Charter becomes part of domestic law. So we have a clear constitutional provision that binds us to international law in this case, and an international legal regime that suggests that the U.S. had no authorization or justification for the invasion. Okay. That would suggest that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful, or, in other words, illegal, or, in another word, using the language of international law, it was what is called a crime against peace. A crime against peace is the international legal term for an act of aggression, the commencing of a war. Okay? Now, that's a pretty bold statement on my part, yes? This is not something one hears in the news or discussed in politics. People may agree or disagree about the Iraq War, about whether we should stay, whether we should leave, all sorts of agreements, disagreements. But this is a very different kind of claim. This says the invasion itself was unlawful and illegal.